Max had never truly understood the concept of time the way humans did. He didn't measure his days in minutes or hours. He measured them in sense, in movements, in the rhythm of footsteps, in the silent language between a soldier and his dog. For years, his world had revolved around one man, John Carter. John wasn't just his handler, he was everything. His leader, his partner, his best friend. They had faced battles together, moving as one, their trust in each other unshaken even in the face of chaos. Max had learned to read the slightest tension in John's posture, the unspoken commands in his eyes. Together they had walked through fire, through deserts, through the shadows where danger lurked unseen. And yet, despite all the training, despite all the missions, there had been one thing John had whispered to him more than anything else. "Protect them, Max, no matter what." At first, Max hadn't understood what it meant. John's scent had always been laced with determination, with resolve, but when he spoke of them, there had been something different, a softness, a longing, a need that ran deeper than duty. Max hadn't known, back then, that one day those words would become his final order. The day everything changed, the air smelled different. Max had sensed it before John even spoke. There had been tension in his every movement, in the way he had run his fingers through Max's fur with a kind of slowness, as if memorizing the feel of it. John had knelt beside him, his voice quiet but firm. "You're going to take care of them now, Max." Max had tilted his head, ears twitching. There was something final in John's tone, something Max didn't have a name for. Then there had been the scent of gunpowder, the metallic tang of blood, the sounds of a world crumbling around him. John had fallen. Max had lunged, snarling, his teeth bared at the enemy, at the ones who had stolen his world. He had fought, but it hadn't been enough. When the dust settled, when the chaos faded, John's body had been still. Max had nudged him, whimpered, waited for the familiar voice to call him back into action. But there had been nothing, no warmth, no command, just silence. Humans called it death. Max didn't have a word for it. He only knew that John had gone and that something inside him had shattered. But even in those last moments, he had remembered the order. Protect them, Max, no matter what. So when they took him away from the battlefield, when they placed him in front of two unfamiliar faces, he had understood. This was his new mission. The first time Max laid eyes on Sophia Carter, he knew she carried a wound that no one could see. She was smaller than John, barely reaching his shoulders, her frame delicate but tense, like a soldier always on alert. Her eyes, so much like John's, were full of something unspoken. Grief, anger, loss. She didn't reach for him, didn't call his name like humans usually did when they met a dog. Instead, she just stared, her fingers clenching at the fabric of her sweater, her jaw tight. Max could smell it on her, the pain, the confusion. Karen, her mother, had tried to speak softly, had tried to place a gentle hand on Sophia's shoulder. "Sweetheart, this is Max. Your father wanted him to be with us." Sophia hadn't responded. Her heartbeat had remained steady, but Max could hear the way her breath hitched, the way she fought against whatever storm raged inside her. Max had stayed still, watching her, waiting. It had taken days for her to acknowledge him. She had ignored him at first, avoiding his gaze, avoiding everything that reminded her of John. Max had sensed her withdrawal, but he hadn't pushed. He had just waited, because he knew loss, and he knew that no matter how much she tried to pretend otherwise, Sophia Carter was broken. It was late one night when she finally spoke to him. The house had been quiet. Karen had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of pretending everything was fine. Sophia had been sitting by the window, staring at something unseen. Max had moved closer, his paws silent against the floor. She hadn't looked at him, not at first. But then, after a long moment, She had exhaled and murmured, "I don't need you." Max had tilted his head. He hadn't moved. Sophia's fingers had clenched into fists, her voice sharp even though it wavered. "You don't get it. You're not him. You'll never be him." Max had understood. She wasn't rejecting him. She was rejecting what he represented. John was gone, and Max was the last piece of him left. So Max had done the only thing he could. He had sat beside her, silent, unmoving. Minutes passed, hours. Then finally, she had moved. Just a fraction, just enough that her shoulder brushed against his. She hadn't spoken again, but she hadn't moved away either, and Max had known. This was how it began. Max had always understood duty. He had always followed orders. But this was different. Sophia didn't need just protection. She needed something else. She needed someone who wouldn't ask her to be okay. Someone who wouldn't expect her to move on. Someone who would just be there. So Max had stayed. When she curled up on the couch and stared at the TV without really watching, Max had laid beside her, his head resting on his paws. When she slammed doors and refused to talk to Karen, Max had waited outside her room, his ears flicking at every muffled sob. When the nights were too long, when her nightmares sent her bolting upright in bed, gasping for air, Max had been there, pressing his weight against her side until her heartbeat slowed. She never thanked him. She never said his name the way John had. But every day, little by little, she stopped pushing him away. One afternoon, weeks after their first meeting, she had hesitated before stepping outside. She had glanced back, eyes wary, almost uncertain. And then, so quietly, Max had barely heard it. "Are you coming?" She hadn't waited for his answer, but she hadn't needed to. Max had already been at her side, walking in step with her, just like he always would. Just like John would have wanted, because this was his new mission. And this time, Max would not fail. Max didn't know what the future held. He didn't know what dangers lay ahead, what battles he would have to fight to keep them safe. But he did know one thing. He had lost John once. He would not lose Sophia. Not while he still had breath in his body. And if danger came knocking, if the shadows of the past tried to steal her away, Max would be ready. Because a soldier never abandons his mission. And Max's mission was Sophia Carter, forever. Max had never trusted silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind, the kind that came with lazy afternoons or quiet nights spent beside Sophia. No, this was the kind that came before a storm, the kind that stretched out, waiting to be broken. Max could sense it before anyone else. At first, it had been small things, a shift in the wind, a scent that didn't belong, the faint hum of an engine lingering too long on the same street. Then, the patterns started forming. The same dark-colored SUVs driving past the house, disappearing down the block only to circle back an hour later. The same unfamiliar figures standing just a little too long at the corner store across the street. The scent of gun oil and tension, seeping through the air like an invisible poison. It wasn't normal. Humans, for all their intelligence, were slow to notice threats that didn't come with flashing lights or loud warnings. But Max noticed. His instincts screamed at him. Danger was coming. He paced by the window, muscles coiled, ears flicking at every passing noise. His body vibrated with the kind of anticipation that had been drilled into him over years of combat. He had seen this before, the slow, creeping approach of something inevitable, the kind of danger that didn't announce itself with a bang, but with whispers, with shadows lurking just out of sight. Max stood watch, and he waited. But the worst part? Sophia and Karen hadn't noticed a thing. There were moments when Max wished he could be something else, just a dog. He wished he could chase the ball when Sophia tossed it, instead of analyzing the way her arm moved, predicting every slight shift in her stance. He wished he could roll in the grass, soaking in the sun instead of scanning every inch of their yard for unseen threats. But he couldn't. Because Max was not just a dog, He was a soldier, a protector, a guardian, and he couldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. There were nights when Sophia would lie beside him on the porch, staring up at the stars. She would talk about things he didn't fully understand, about school, about books she loved, about how she missed her father but didn't know how to say it out loud. Max wanted to focus on her voice, on the warmth of her presence. But his ears stayed trained on the sounds beyond their home, his nose catching every unfamiliar scent drifting through the night air. He wanted to be present, but he couldn't afford to be. Because the moment he let go, the moment he allowed himself to sink into that fleeting comfort would be the moment something slipped through the cracks. And he would not fail her, not like he had failed John. Sophia had always trusted Max, but not like this. She trusted him to be her shadow, to be by her side when the nightmares became too much. She trusted him to listen, to understand her silence when she couldn't find the words to speak, but she didn't trust his warning signs. Not yet. "Max, what's up with you?" she muttered one afternoon, watching as he stalked toward the window for the 5th time in an hour. He didn't answer, of course. He just stood there, eyes sharp, muscles rigid beneath his fur. She sighed, walking over and crouching beside him. "You're acting weird!" Max flicked his eyes toward her, then back to the street. She followed his gaze, searching for whatever had his attention. But to her, it was just a street. Just cars passing by. Just the neighbors walking their dogs. Nothing was wrong. "Paranoid much?" she muttered, running a hand absently through his fur. "Mom says you've been acting like this all week." Max's ears twitched. He could feel the skepticism in her touch, in the way her fingers hesitated against his fur, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe him or brush it off. She didn't see it. She didn't smell it. She didn't know. And that terrified him. The next evening, Max saw the same SUV for the 3rd time. His fur bristled. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. Sophia was in the front yard, laughing at something on her phone, completely unaware of the slow-moving vehicle rolling past the house. Max's instincts kicked in hard, threat. He let out a sharp bark, his body snapping into alert mode. He positioned himself between Sophia and the street, his tail stiff, his stance unwavering. Sophia jumped at the sound. "Whoa! Chill, boy!" She turned, frowning at the car as it idled at the corner. Then it drove off. She rolled her eyes, giving him a playful shove. "It's just a car, Max. You need to—" But then she paused. A flicker of something crossed her face. Confusion, uncertainty. Because the car had passed by too many times. Because the driver had lingered too long. Because maybe, just maybe, Max wasn't wrong. That night, Sophia sat beside him on the porch. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just ran her fingers along his back, her touch slow, thoughtful. Then finally, "You really think something's wrong, don't you?" Max turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. She wasn't doubting him anymore. She was asking, and that was different. Sophia exhaled, looking out at the darkened street. "Okay," she murmured. "Show me." It was a simple sentence, but to Max, it was everything. It was acknowledgement. It was trust. It was the first step toward facing the storm together. And as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of something unseen, something coming, Max knew. This was just the beginning, because danger was closer than ever. And this time, Sophia Carter was ready to see it. Max had spent his entire life following orders. He had trusted his instincts, protected his partner, and fought battles without hesitation. But this was different. This wasn't just a mission. This was Sophia. And for the first time since losing John, he wasn't just following orders, he was leading. Because when the storm finally hit, when the danger finally reached their doorstep, Max would be the first line of defense. And he would not fail. Not again. Not this time. Max had sensed them before they even arrived. The air felt different, thicker, charged with something invisible but undeniable. For days, he had watched the shadows grow longer around their home. The same vehicles rolling by at odd hours, the same unfamiliar scent clinging to the wind, the same cold, metallic presence that reminded him of war zones, of the places he and John had once walked together. But now, John was gone, and the enemy had finally come knocking. Damien Black, the man behind the darkness. The name Damien Black meant nothing to Max, but he knew a predator when he smelled one. Black was a man who thrived in the underworld, his influence stretching across continents. He was untouchable, ruthless, the kind of man whose name alone made enemies disappear. But there was one thing Black hadn't accounted for. John Carter had left something behind. Evidence. Proof of his crimes. The kind of proof that, if it saw the light of day, could tear down everything he had built. And the key to finding it? Sophia Carter. Damien Black had made his decision. She would be taken. Her mother would be disposed of. And Max? Just a dog. A mere inconvenience. Easily removed. He was wrong. The night was eerily quiet when they came. Max had been lying by the front door, his body tense even in sleep. His dreams had been restless, filled with memories of John, of orders whispered in the dead of night, of missions that required precision and instinct. Then his ears flicked. A sound. Too light for human ears, but not for him. Boots, moving over soft ground, slow, calculated. Max's eyes snapped open, his nose flared, catching the unmistakable scent of gunpowder, sweat, and adrenaline. Intruders. He was on his feet in an instant, moving silently through the house, his body low, his steps controlled. Through the window he saw them, figures slipping through the shadows. Their movements were smooth, professional, not amateurs, trained, armed, dangerous. They weren't here to steal. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to take Sophia. The first mistake the intruders made was underestimating him. They had expected a dog. They had not expected a soldier. The moment the first man stepped through the door, Max was already in motion. A blur of muscle and precision, he lunged, his powerful frame slamming into the intruder's chest, sending the man crashing against the wall. There was no hesitation. Max's teeth found the man's forearm, locking down with force designed to disarm, to incapacitate. The man screamed, a sharp, startled sound that broke the silence. A second intruder swung his rifle toward Max, but he was already gone, moving fast, his training kicking in like second nature. John had taught him where to strike, when to strike. Jaws clamped down on the second man's wrist, right where the nerves were weakest. A gun clattered to the floor, useless now. Max didn't just attack. He calculated. He anticipated. One by one, he tore through their ranks, disabling them before they could react. This wasn't just a house invasion. This was war. From the hallway, Sophia Carter saw everything. Her hands gripped the doorframe, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had known Max was strong, fast, protective. But this was something else. He moved like a shadow, every attack deliberate, every strike precise. He wasn't just a pet. He wasn't just a companion. He was a weapon, a protector forged in battle, trained for war. For the first time, she truly understood why her father had trusted Max with their lives. This wasn't just a dog. This was John Carter's final soldier. And right now, he was fighting for her. For a brief moment, the house fell into silence again, except for the labored breathing of the fallen intruders. Then a voice crackled through an earpiece. "Go for the girl! Now!" Two men, still standing, turned their focus toward Sophia. Max snarled, stepping in front of her, his stance rigid, unyielding. His body was a wall, an immovable force between her and them. One of the men lifted his weapon, and Max lunged. Everything happened in seconds. A gunshot rang out. Sophia flinched, her breath catching in her throat. Max didn't stop moving. Pain tore through his side, but he pushed forward, his momentum too strong to be stopped. He crashed into the gunman, taking him down before the man could fire again. Another sharp crack, and the second intruder dropped, this time from a well-placed shot. Karen Carter stood at the top of the stairs, her hands steady around her late husband's pistol. Her chest rose and fell in sharp breaths, but her grip was unshaken. She had been John Carter's wife. She knew how to protect what was hers. The last remaining intruder hesitated, then turned and ran. Max took a step forward, ready to pursue, then staggered. His legs felt heavy. His breath came shallow. He barely noticed Sophia drop to her knees beside him. "Max!" Her voice was panicked, hands pressing against his fur, blood, his. But he didn't care. The mission wasn't over. His ears twitched, straining. He could still hear the SUV outside, the hum of an engine still running. They would come back. This wasn't over. Sophia's hands trembled as she pressed against his wound. She had never felt so powerless, never so terrified. Not just for herself, but for Max. He had fought for her, bled for her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something shift inside her. She couldn't just be the one protected anymore. She had to fight back. Karen's voice cut through the haze. "We need to move, now!" Max's legs wobbled, but he forced himself up. He wasn't done yet. Sophia looked at him, eyes full of something new, something sharp. "They're coming back, aren't they?" she asked. Max met her gaze, and then, slowly, he nodded. The fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Max had spent years in the field, following orders, fighting battles alongside John Carter. But this wasn't just another mission. This was his family. And for them, Max would keep fighting. For them, he would never fall. Because John Carter had trusted him with their lives. And he would not fail. Not now, not ever. The night smelled of rain and desperation. The world outside was no longer familiar. It had shifted, turned against them. The house that had once been a sanctuary was now a battleground. The shadows that had once been harmless were now hiding enemies. And the road ahead? It was unknown, uncharted, but it was the only way forward. Max stood in front of Sophia and Karen, his body tense, his breath steady despite the pain searing through his side. He could feel the warmth of his own blood, sticky against his fur. But pain was secondary. Sophia's hands were still on him, her fingers shaking as she tried to assess his wound. "We have to stop the bleeding," she whispered. "Max, you—" But Max didn't have time to stop. Neither did they. A car engine growled in the distance, headlights flashing for just a second before cutting out. Another one followed. More were coming. The enemy wasn't gone. They were regrouping. Karen's voice was firm but urgent. "We need to move! Now!" Max took a step forward, then another. His instincts screamed at him to lead, to find a way out, because if they stayed, they wouldn't last the night. They ran. Through darkened streets, through alleyways slick with rain, through back roads that twisted and turned away from the main city. Max stayed ahead of them, his nose guiding the way, ears catching the smallest sounds. He was more than just a protector now. He was their guide. Karen had the training, but Max had something else. He knew how hunters thought, because once he had been one of them. The realization burned in the back of his mind as he led them further into the night, putting as much distance as he could between them and the men hunting them. They were moving fast, but so were their enemies. The scent of gunpowder still clung to the air. Their pursuers weren't far behind. Sophia's breathing was ragged, but she pushed forward, her determination matching Max's. She no longer hesitated, no longer asked questions. She trusted him. Finally. They stopped in an abandoned warehouse, hidden away from the main road. Karen secured the doors, while Sophia knelt beside Max, her hands hovering over his wound again. "We need to stop this bleeding," she insisted, grabbing a piece of torn fabric from her sleeve to press against it. Max let her. But his mind wasn't on the pain. It was on them. The men who had stormed their home weren't just random mercenaries. Max had recognized one of them, not by name, not by voice, but by scent. It had been years, a lifetime ago, before John, before he had learned what it meant to be more than a weapon. Max had been trained in darkness, conditioned to follow commands without question. He had been raised for war, a tool sharpened for violence, never meant to think for himself. Until John. John had seen something in him that no one else had taken him away from the hands of men like Damian Black, had trained him not to be a machine, but a soldier with a purpose beyond blind obedience. And now here he was, fighting against the very people who had once made him. Sophia's hands were still shaking as she worked. "Max," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "what did they do to you?" She didn't expect an answer. But Max knew she had seen it now. The truth. She understood. And that made her even more dangerous to the men who wanted to silence them. The first gunshot shattered the silence. Sophia flinched, but she didn't freeze. Karen grabbed her by the arm, pulling her behind cover. "They found us." Max was already up, ignoring the pain lacing through his side. He growled, muscles coiled, ready to fight again. But this time, he wasn't the only one ready to fight. Sophia's eyes were different now. They weren't just afraid. They were determined. She grabbed the weapon Karen handed her, a small, compact firearm, one that had belonged to John. Sophia's fingers curled around it, her breath unsteady but her grip firm. Karen hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Only if you have no choice." Sophia swallowed. Then, for the first time, she nodded back. Max saw it. The moment she stopped being the girl who needed saving and became the fighter she was meant to be. The warehouse was old, full of stacked crates and rusted metal beams, the perfect place for an ambush. Karen took the first shot, hitting one of the attackers before he could get close. Max moved before the others could react. Pain be damned, he launched himself at the nearest enemy, slamming into the man's chest with enough force to send him sprawling. Teeth tore through fabric and flesh. The man screamed. Another gunshot rang out. Sophia. Max turned in time to see her standing there, shoulders squared, weapon aimed. The man she had shot wasn't dead, but he was down, his gun skidding across the floor. She had acted, not in fear, not in hesitation, in control. Max felt something shift inside him. She had saved herself. And for the first time, Max knew she was ready. The last of the mercenaries retreated, realizing they had underestimated their targets. Karen grabbed Sophia's hand. "We have to go before more come." Sophia nodded, but she didn't move right away. Instead, she turned to Max. His breathing was heavy, his wound still fresh, but he stood firm. He was still here, and so was she. Without hesitation, she placed a hand on his head, her fingers pressing lightly against his fur. "Come on, Max," she whispered. "Let's finish this." Max didn't need an order, didn't need a command. He followed her, because Sophia Carter was no longer just a girl running from danger. She was running toward the truth. And Max? Max would be right there beside her, every step of the way. The road ahead was still uncertain. They were still being hunted. The truth they carried was a weapon more dangerous than any bullet. But for the first time, Max knew they had a chance. Because Sophia was no longer just the mission. She was a warrior, and Max would make sure she lived to see this fight through, no matter what it took, because that's what John Carter would have wanted, and that's what Max would die to protect. The air was thick with the scent of rust, oil, and something far more sinister, anticipation. Max had been in places like this before. Dark, empty warehouses with towering steel beams, crates stacked like barricades, and the kind of silence that wasn't really silence at all. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. Karen and Sophia stood just behind him, their breathing shallow, their footsteps cautious against the cold concrete. They had made it this far. They had the proof that could bring Damian Black down. But they weren't alone. Max's ears twitched. Then, a slow, deliberate clap echoed through the cavernous space. "Well done," a voice drawled. From the shadows, Damian Black stepped forward. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. The kind of man who thought he had already won before the fight had even begun. His suit was crisp, dark, unbothered by the chaos he had caused. His sharp eyes flickered between Sophia and Karen before settling on Max. And then, he smiled. "There you are." Max stiffened. The moment Black spoke, something inside him recognized the tone, the cadence, the chilling amusement beneath the words. Because Max had heard that voice before, years ago, in another life. Damian Black had once given orders that Max had been trained to follow, had once seen him as nothing more than a weapon. And now, Max was standing against him. "Traitor," Black murmured, shaking his head. "John Carter thought he could rewrite your instincts, but at the end of the day you were built to obey." His expression hardened. "And now you'll die for that mistake." Max's growl started deep in his chest, a low, steady rumble that filled the room. His body was battered, his muscles strained, but his purpose had never been clearer. He was not a weapon, not for Black, not for anyone. He was here to protect his family. The attack came fast. Armed men stepped out from the shadows, their weapons drawn, but Max moved first. Pain be damned. The first man never saw him coming. Max was a blur of muscle and instinct, his powerful jaws clamping down on the attacker's wrist before he could even fire a shot. A gun clattered to the ground. A scream followed. Then, chaos. Karen pulled Sophia behind a stack of crates, returning fire with deadly accuracy. The room exploded into a storm of bullets and movement. Max fought like he had been born for this moment, because in a way, he had. Another mercenary lunged toward Sophia. Max pivoted, his injured side burning, but he didn't stop. He would not stop. He slammed into the man's legs, sending him sprawling. His teeth found their mark, flesh, bone, vulnerability. He had fought wars before, but never like this, never with so much to lose. Sophia did not freeze. Not this time. She had watched Max fight. She had watched her mother stand her ground, and now it was her turn. Black was moving through the chaos, untouched, focused. He didn't care about the battle raging around him. He only cared about the evidence. And Sophia had it. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket. The proof her father had died for. The proof that could finally end this. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear. She would not run. Instead, she reached for the control panel on the nearest crate. The warehouse wasn't just full of storage containers. It was full of automated cargo arms, giant mechanical arms that lifted and moved shipments with lethal precision. She saw the blinking controls. She had an idea. Damian Black finally noticed her. He was too close, too confident. "Hand it over," he said, stepping forward, "and I'll make this quick." Sophia's fingers tightened over the controls. She met his gaze. Then, she pressed the button. With a deafening whir, the cargo arm overhead swung to life. Black's smirk vanished the moment the steel beam came crashing down, missing him by mere inches. "Move!" Karen shouted, and Sophia ran. Black was fast, but he wasn't fast enough. More machinery roared to life, slamming down, cutting off his exits. This wasn't just chaos. This was calculated. Sophia had set the trap, and Black had walked right into it. Max was hurt. His vision swam for just a second, but when he saw Black reach for his weapon, all the exhaustion vanished. Not her, not Sophia, not Karen. Max moved. One last charge, one last battle. His body slammed into Black's side, sending him crashing to the ground. The gun skidded across the floor. Black gritted his teeth, trying to push Max off, but Max was relentless. He was not going to let this monster take anything else from them. Then, a click. A gun cocked, not Black's, Sophia's. She stood over them, her hands shaking but steady enough. "Don't move," she said. And for the first time, Damian Black obeyed. The sirens came minutes later. FBI agents stormed the warehouse, weapons drawn, orders shouted. Black's men were either unconscious or captured. And Damian Black himself? He was forced to his knees, defeated. Sophia watched as they handcuffed him, as they took away the man who had tried to destroy her family. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she turned to Max. He was still standing. Barely. His legs trembled, his breaths were labored, his fur matted with blood. He had won, but the cost had been too high. Karen rushed to Max, pressing her hands against his fur, whispering to him, telling him to hold on. Sophia knelt beside him. "Max!" Her voice broke. "Stay with me." Max blinked slowly. He was tired. So tired. But as his gaze locked onto Sophia's, he saw it. Not fear, not sadness, strength. She had fought. She had stood her ground. She had won, and John would have been proud. Max let out a slow breath. The fight was over. He had kept his promise. And as darkness crept at the edges of his vision, he knew. Sophia didn't need protecting anymore. She was ready. And so, finally, Max let go. The battle was won. Damian Black was finished. The world knew the truth. But some victories came at a cost. And Max? He had been more than a warrior, more than a protector. He had been family, and even in the silence that followed, his legacy would never fade. The world had changed. The air no longer carried the scent of fear. The echoes of gunfire, the tension that had once gripped every waking moment, had faded into memory. The war was over, but victory had come at a cost. Sophia knelt beside Max, her fingers buried in his fur, her breath shaky as she tried to keep herself together. He was still with her, but his breaths were slowing. His body was still. The warmth she had always felt beneath her touch was fading. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They had won. They had survived. And yet here he was, dying in her arms. "Max, don't leave me," she whispered, her voice cracked. Max's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but his body was too heavy to move. His vision blurred, edges darkening, but he could still see her. His Sophia. She had grown. She was no longer the frightened girl who had once tried to push him away. No longer the child hiding behind shadows, waiting for someone else to fight for her. She had fought. She had won. And John would have been proud. The world around Max began to fade. The cold concrete floor beneath him was gone. The pain in his body drifted away, replaced by something warmer, familiar. And then he saw him. John Carter stood before him, the same calm, steady presence that had once been Max's entire world. The man smiled. "You did good, buddy." Max's tail twitched slightly, as if he could still wag it. John knelt beside him, his hand reaching out, not to command, not to order, but to simply be there. "I knew you'd keep your promise," John murmured, his voice gentle. "I knew you'd protect them." Max blinked slowly, feeling peace for the first time in years. But then, he turned his head back to the world he was leaving behind, back to Sophia. She was still holding on to him, refusing to let go. She wasn't a child anymore. She had found her strength. And Max knew. She didn't need him to protect her anymore. She was ready. A low, final breath escaped his lungs. And then, he let go. Sophia felt it happen. One moment his chest was rising and falling beneath her hands. The next, stillness. A sharp sob tore through her, but she didn't look away. She had spent too much of her life running from loss. She had lost her father. She had lost the life she once knew. And now, She had lost Max, too. But this time, she wouldn't let grief consume her. This time she understood. Max hadn't just been her protector. He had been her guide, her link to her father, the last living piece of the man who had given everything to keep her safe. And now it was her turn to carry on that legacy. With trembling hands, Sophia reached for Max's collar. The same collar he had worn since the day he came into her life. The same collar her father had placed on him all those years ago. Carefully, she unbuckled it. It felt heavier than it should have. Max was free now. His duty was done. And as Sophia held the collar against her chest, she realized, so was hers. She was no longer the girl who needed saving. She was the one who would protect. She was her father's daughter, and she would make sure his sacrifice, and Max's, would never be forgotten. Karen knelt beside her, her hand resting gently on Sophia's shoulder. "He's at peace now," she whispered. Sophia swallowed hard, blinking against the burning in her eyes. She knew. She knew. But that didn't make it easier. For a long moment, she just sat there, her fingers still curled around Max's fur, unwilling to let go of the warmth that remained. But eventually, she nodded. They had to move forward, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And Max wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Days passed, then weeks. The world moved on. Damian Black's empire crumbled. His arrest had sent shockwaves through the underground world he had ruled for so long. The evidence John Carter had sacrificed his life for was finally exposed. The people who had once seemed untouchable were now facing justice. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia and Karen weren't running anymore. They were free. But freedom didn't mean forgetting. Sophia still woke up some mornings expecting to hear Max's footsteps outside her door. She still caught herself glancing at the porch, waiting for his silhouette to appear. But the house was quiet now, and that silence, once suffocating, was now a comfort. Because Max had given them this peace, and she refused to let it go to waste. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia sat on the front steps, the same place she had so often found Max watching over them. The sky was painted in gold and crimson, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Karen stepped outside, a cup of tea in her hands. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. They sat there, side by side, watching the sky shift, breathing in the stillness. Then Sophia reached into her pocket. Max's collar. The leather was worn, the metal tags scratched from years of service. She ran her fingers over the engraved name, Maximum. She smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. And for a moment, just a moment, she swore she felt a familiar warmth beside her. A presence that would never truly be gone. Because Max wasn't just a dog. He was family, and even though he was no longer by her side, his spirit would never leave her. He had kept his promise. And now, it was her turn. She would live. She would fight for what was right. She would carry on. Because that's what John Carter would have wanted, and because that's what Max had fought for. Max had spent his life protecting those he loved, and in the end, he had given them everything: peace, freedom, strength, and most of all, a future. Sophia Carter was no longer afraid. She carried Max's memory in every step she took, and though he was gone, his legacy would never fade. Because heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they walk on 4 legs, and sometimes they leave behind more than just memories. They leave behind hope. Some dog stories are just about companionship, but this one goes beyond that. It's a heartwarming story about loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of love. Max, a German shepherd, represents more than just a protector. He embodies what it means to be family. His devotion isn't about blind obedience. It's about the kind of love that asks for nothing in return, the kind that stands unwavering in the face of danger. True loyalty isn't just following commands. It's sacrifice, selflessness, and the willingness to protect, no matter the cost. Max's presence in the Carter family proves that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people, or in this case, the guardian, who stands beside you when the world feels unsafe. Some warriors fight with weapons, but Max fought with his heart. He wasn't just a dog, he was a friend, a soldier, and the unshakable spirit of his family. His story reminds us that love isn't measured by time, but by the impact we leave behind. And sometimes, the greatest heroes walk on four legs, leaving paw prints not just on the ground, but on the hearts of those they protect. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.